Hello students. In the previous lectures I talked about Chaucer's age, his milieu, the era before Chaucer and during Chaucer. Now in this lecture I would like to talk about Chaucer's prologue and Chaucer's own poetic career, his life. The most famous and characteristic work by Chaucer is the Canterbury Tales, which is a collection of short stories told by whom? By the pilgrims, where on their way to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket, where? At Canterbury. The shrine is situated at Canterbury. So these pilgrims represent different sections of contemporary English society, the society in which Chaucer lived. And in the description of the most prominent of these people in the prologue, Chaucer's powers are shown at their very highest. All these characters, all these pilgrims who happen to be the characters are individualized, yet their thoroughly typical quality gives unique value to Chaucer's picture of man and the manners in the England of his time. By observing their manners, by observing their styles, we can have a picture of English society and the contemporary England. The Canterbury Tales is a landmark in the history of English poetry because here Chaucer enriched the English language and meter to such an extent that now it could be conveniently used for any purpose. Chaucer set the tone. He wrote heroic couplet, he popularized heroic couplet. Moreover, by introducing a variety of highly finished characters into a single action and engaging them in an animated dialogue, Chaucer fulfilled every requirement of the dramatist, short of bringing his plays on the stage. The characters are active. They are acting. They are in action. And it appears that as if it is a drama. Also, by drawing finished and various portraits in verse, he showed the way to the novelist of poetic characters. He may be called the first novelist in English literature. Chaucer's works fall into three periods. We can divide his creation into three periods, first phase, second phase, third phase. During the first period, he imitated French models, particularly the famous and very long poem Le Roman de la Rose, of which he made a translation, Romance of the Rose, or you can say Romance of the Rose. So this poem, which gives an intimate introduction to the medieval French romances and allegories of courtly love, is an embryo out of which the Chaucer's poetry grows. During this period, he also wrote the Book of the Duchess, which is an elegy written in its form and nature is like the Romance of the Rose. Complaint unto Pity is another shorter poem, and ABC, a series of stanzas religious in tone, in which each stanza opens with a letter of alphabet in order. One stanza opens with A alphabetic letter, the next begins with B letter, the still next with C letter. So there's a new technique in this poem. The poems of the second period, which began in 1373 and ended in 84, show the influence of Italian literature. So we can say second phase or Italian phase, especially of Dante's Divine Comedy and Boccaccio's poems. In this period, or during this period, he wrote the Parliament of the Fowls, which contains very dramatic and satiric dialogues between the assembled birds. Some birds, assemble at a place and they talk to each other. Troilus and Cresside, which narrates the story of the Trojan prince Troilus and his love for a damsel Cressida. The story of Gracilda, another poem in which is given a pitiful picture of womanhood, and another poem, the House of Fame, which is a masterpiece comic fantasy with a graver undertone of contemplation of human folly. So these are some poems or poetic works written during the Italian phase or the second phase, when he was influenced by Italian literature. Chaucer's third period, which began in 1384 and lasted till 90, may be called the English period, because in it he threw off foreign influences and showed native originality. That is why it is called English period. The Legend of Good Women. This is a poem. In this poem he employs for the first time the heroic couplet. It was during this period that he wrote the Canterbury Tales. Very famous poem. His greatest poetic achievement, which places us in the heart of London. Here we find his gentle, his kindly humor, which is Chaucer's greatest quality at its very best. Chaucer's importance in the development of English literature is great. Why? Because he removed poetry from the region of metaphysics, from the region of theology. Because earlier, poetry was written and the theme was religion and religious teachings of Bible and other thing. He made it hold as it were the mirror of the nature. He thus brought back the old classical principle of the direct imitation of nature. He tried to imitate nature. Chaucer's successors after Chaucer there was a decline in poetry for about 100 years. Whenever there is a great writer, after his death there is a vacuum. So there was a vacuum after Chaucer. The years from 1400 to the Renaissance were a period bereft of literature. Very trivial works were being written and there was no great work. There were only a few minor poets, the imitators and successors of Chaucer. The poets who followed Chaucer simply imitated him. So they were called the English and Scottish Chaucerians, who wrote during this barren period after Chaucer. This main cause of the decline of literature during this period was that no writer of genius was born. during those long years, during those 100 years. Lydgate, Harris, Skelton, Henryson, Dunbar, and you may say Douglas. They all did little but copy him, and they represent an era of mediocrity in English literature that continues up to the time of Renaissance. That means almost 100 years after his death, there was little development in English literature, no creation of any importance. Geoffrey Chaucer at court, he worked in the court from 1367 to 1400. I mean, during whole his literary period. In 1367, one of the 4 new yeomen of the chamber in the household of Edward III is Chaucer. His age was, I think 27 at that time. The young man's wife, Philippa, is already a lady in waiting to be queen. A few years later, Chaucer becomes one of the king's esquires, with duties which include entertaining the court with stories and music. So he became a squire in the court of the then king, and he entertained the court with stories and music. There can rarely have been a more inspired appointment in that court than Chaucer's. Chaucer's poems are designed to be read aloud. Their range from high romance to bawdy comedy is well calculated to hold the listeners spellbound. Courtly circles in England are his first audience. Then, his works got published, and his works reached to a larger audience. Even now, these days, we are reading Chaucer's works like the prologue. Chaucer's public career is one of almost unbroken success in 2 consecutive reigns. He undertakes diplomatic missions abroad on behalf of the king. He is given administrative posts such as controlling the customs, which bring lodgings and handsome stipend. When Bolingbroke unseated Richard II in 1399, taking his place on the throne as Henry IV, Chaucer combined diplomacy and wit to secure his position again in the court. Having lost his royal appointments, he reminds the new king of his predicament in a poem entitled "The Complaint of Chaucer to His Empty Purse." It's a very witty work where he tells about his own position. He lost his job and these things. The last line of each verse begs the purse to be heavy again, or else must I die, he says in that poem. Henry IV hears the message. The court poet is given a new annuity. So, new plan is given. He gets higher salary now. Henry was certainly aware that he was keeping his royal circle a poet of great distinction. Chaucer's reputation was such that when he died in the following year, he was granted a very unusual honor. Can you imagine what kind of honor was he granted? Because he was a common man, yet he was granted a great honor. What kind of honor? Of being buried in Westminster's Abbey. He was the first poet, first writer to be buried in that place. Later on, a corner was reserved for English poets where great writers were buried. Thank you for listening me patiently, and thank you again for